Most people have this idea that the pinnacle of the spiritual life is never sinning. But if you read the spiritual authors throughout time, every single one of them says that's the beginning of the spiritual life, not the end. And then the question becomes, well, then why aren't I acting perfectly virtuous if I have all these virtues? It's very simple. St. Thomas says that the infused virtues cannot become fully operative. That is, they can't become fully active in our lives unless we've first developed the natural virtue in that area. Right? People today don't have any semblance of what prudence is whatsoever. The virtues are just lost today on most people, but part of it is the church's own fault. We haven't been preaching them for decades, and yet it's precisely through the building of the virtues. So when I perform a morally good act, and I do it for a supernatural intention, I'm in the state of grace, I actually start increasing my sanctifying grace, and as a result I become holier on a very basic elementary level. This is why most people are blocked. What's another name for this lack of virtue? It's called vice, but it's also a defect. It's an inclination to the wrong things. You're not going to grow in holiness until you start intentionally building a life of virtue. It's not something that you can just bumble your way across. It's not something where you can just go do a holy hour once in a while, even though that's good. It's something where you have to take a stock at taking a look at your virtues and say, where do I need to go from here? So in the virtues, they say there's 64 virtues. Depends on how you count them. There's 64 virtues. The first level of virtue is acquired virtues of prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice. These acquired virtues are things that they have us as their cause. We can build them up on our own. I'm going to return back to those because those become really important. Even though the theological virtues are the highest, there's something about those natural virtues that becomes key in the advance in the spiritual life. So there's these acquired virtues that we can just cause on our own. But when you're in the state of grace, God infuses in your soul also all of the moral virtue, the supernatural moral virtues. So there's a natural prudence and a natural temperance. A natural temperance would be an example of, I'm going to eat this food because it's good for my health, rather than, the Cheetos and the stuff, even though I like Cheetos. I'm not going to eat the Cheetos. I'm going to eat this tofu. So I'm not so sure that's good for you either. The point being is that natural virtue then starts getting our lower faculties subordinated to right reason, illuminated by faith. People ask me, what virtues do I need to work on? It's really simple. If you have any emotion or anything to which your emotion is attached, to which you notice that you don't have perfect equanimity in relationship to it means there's a lack of virtue in that area. So for example, if you find that your spouse makes you angry, it's a sign that you have not mastered, even on the basic level of acquired virtue, meekness. And so you have to start working on those particular things. So there's the acquired virtues, and those deal with natural things. But then there's the infused virtues, and those deal with God, ultimately. So the infused virtue of temperance, of fasting, because fasting is actually a virtue, even on a natural level, right? So I get such a charge out of how they just recently found out that intermittent fasting is actually good for your health, and they act like this is just a stroke of genius. And you're just like, really? The church has been knowing that fasting is good for us, not just on a physical level, but it's actually good for us spiritually, because in fasting, the intellect and the will have to maintain the course in what it knows is right, despite the fact that the lower faculties want to go and eat the cheesecake, right? And so this is a key thing in which that fasting just helps us to get these things under control. Well, I'm going to return to this here in just a little bit. But then the supernatural virtues deal with God. So the supernatural virtue of fasting means that you're doing it for God's sake, not for the sake of health, but for God's sake. Or in the case of supernatural justice. So for example, you're going to sacrifice something for God's sake. And so these are all have God as their end. Now, if God infuses those in us when we're in the state of sanctifying grace, and we all have them, so if you've been to confession and you know you're in the state of grace, and then the question becomes, well, then why aren't I acting perfectly virtuous if I have all these virtues? It's very simple. St. Thomas says that the infused virtues cannot become fully operative. That is, they can't become fully active in our lives unless we've first developed the natural virtue in that area. This is a very key point. If you lack the natural virtue of meekness, you will not have the supernatural virtue of meekness. You'll have it, but it simply won't function. It won't work. As you start to gain that natural virtue, it removes, St. Thomas says, the impediment in the lower faculties towards the operation of those higher virtues. And then as a result, we actually become more meek, more temperate, more just, etc., more prudent. Right? People today don't have any semblance of what prudence is whatsoever. The virtues are just lost today on most people, but part of it is the church's own fault. We haven't been preaching them for decades, and yet it's precisely through the building of the virtues. So when I perform a morally good act, and I do it for a supernatural intention, I'm in the state of grace, I actually start increasing my sanctifying grace, and as a result I become holier. This means in order for me to really get to the point where I'm really performing those virtues well, I've got to get these lower virtues mastered first on a very basic elementary level. This is why most people are blocked. What's another name for this lack of virtue? It's called vice, but it's also a defect. It's an inclination to the wrong things. Right? I don't relate well to my husband, or I don't relate well to my wife, I don't relate well to my daughter, or what have you. And that's an indicator that those lower faculties have not been perfectly subordinated to the intellect. So there's a connection between this two. So we're going to start building a sense of what the goal is. Then the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Charity doesn't become perfect until what? Until those supernatural virtues become perfected and become operative. So what does this mean? You're never going to master love of your neighbor until you get, for example, just basic temperance under control. And this is because it keeps building. This is why people keep stalling out in the spiritual life. So then we see this. So I have to start working on these virtues. I have to build them. I have to get rid of my vices and my defects. Most people have this idea that the pinnacle of the spiritual life is never sinning. But if you read the spiritual authors throughout time, every single one of them says that's the beginning of the spiritual life, not the end. The first thing that you have to do is eradicate even venial sin from your life. What does that look like? Well, okay, so there's 3 stages of the interior life, they tell us. The first is the active purgative way. And the active purgative way is essentially stop sinning and get these lower virtues cleaned up to the degree that you can. Most people don't seem to realize too is that sin causes a lot of damage. You know, people have this idea that, you know, once I go to confession, my job's done, I've got nothing else to do, I'm good, I'm in the state of grace. That's not how this works. It's true that the culpability of the sin has now been absolved and you're no longer bound by in the tribunal of God's justice, you're no longer bound for having violated his law. And that's true that does actually, that it's absolved in the will. But every time you sin, you darken your intellect, you move your lower faculties to consider the thing and under the wrong aspect, and you disorder your lower faculties. This is why we have to spend time in purgatory, because we're a mess. But that mess is pretty deep. It's not just a matter of, oh, now I can just kind of stop this and then it'll go away. That this active purgative way, we get to the point where we can get to the point where we can remove all our defects to the degree that we can. And that basically means at that point we've stopped sinning. And then it doesn't mean from time to time people don't, but it just means that for all practical purposes, they don't even have even venial sin in their life. Then because our sin is so disordering to our faculties and so disordering to our will, God has to put us through the same part of the same purgative stage, which is the passive purgative stage, which is where he has to plunge the person into such darkness and suffering that because he's got to purify the soul of all of these defects. Let me give you an example of why he's got to do this. Most people never master the virtue of mortification, where you suffer well. It's a sub-virtue to the virtue of fortitude, where we engage in things that are hard and difficult. And they never really master that. And we can master it to a certain degree, but then there's an indicator, and this is what the saints often talk about, is they're starting to advance in holiness. They begin to realize that they've gotten to a certain point, but they're still very capable of falling down if God retracts His grace. And so this lack of mortification is such that those faculties haven't gotten to the point. They might be able to suffer little things well, but when it comes to, or even greater things, but not the little things, he comes running in and goes to his mom's laying on the bed and says, "Mom, mommy, mother, mom, mommy, mommy." And he just does this for like a minute and a half, right? And finally she just blows up. "What? Hi," and then he runs off, right? Okay. The point being is that most people don't have perfect equanimity. Even when they're dealing with something and they're trying not to react badly, that interior peace is upset, and that's a sign that there's a lack of order in their soul. The definition of peace is the tranquility of order. It's when everything in the interior life is perfectly ordered. There's peace, there's this tranquility of quietness interiorly, even when people are doing things that could normally drive us crazy. But most people, the saints say that they have to go through tremendous amounts of mortification on a level that is above and beyond us as human beings to sustain, because God sustains us by their grace in order to purify the soul. Again, this is why we have to spend time in purgatory unless we do it in this life. So that's the first stage. Then there's the illuminative stage. And basically during this stage, God strips us, St. John of the Cross says, of even our ability to remember God, to understand things of God, and our concepts of God. They just get stripped from us. And he says it's not because they're necessarily false. He says it's because they're disproportionate to who He really is. And so He has to take that from us. And that plunges people into tremendous darkness, which causes enormous amounts of pain and suffering. Because it's also at that time that there's this rise, this increase in charity, because again, charity becomes more operative because all of these defects have now left, and now they become much more desiring for God. And so it becomes very painful that they can't even think about Him. And the reason He does that is so St. John of the Cross says, so that He can infuse in them a true understanding. It's at that point that people pivot from a normal life of prayer, which we're going to talk about here in a minute, to a mystical life of prayer. Because God has to show us who He is. Because we don't really understand Him proportionately. You know, you can tell that people don't have a clue about God. They really don't have a clue about Him. One time, this one woman, I was sitting listening to her talking, and for about 10 minutes, she just starts off with this, "I think God this, and I think God that, and I think God this, and I think God that." And by the end, I'm like, she doesn't even understand who God is at all. So I said to the Holy Spirit, "You got to give me something with this. I don't know what I'm going to tell this woman." So it kind of came to me. Hopefully it was a grace. But I said to her, "Well, maybe we should ask God what He thinks of Himself." She looked at me and she says, "Well, that's a novel idea." And I said, "No, it's called revelation." Right? God reveals to us who He is, right? And this is a necessary thing. Why is that important? It means if God is your goal, if you're shooting towards an end, it's like a gun. If I'm not looking through the lens in the right way, I'm not going to hit the target. I have to be looking exactly down the scope, exactly at the right angle, and then I have to line it up. And that means that the goal, that is God, is the determining factor, St. Thomas says, so the end, that is God, is the determining factor of the means, how you're going to get there. This is a very key point. This is why Buddha is not a means to salvation. This is why Muhammad is not a means to salvation. This is why no one else but Jesus Christ is a means to salvation, because only He is the one who revealed to us the necessary knowledge about the means to attain what He finally taught us in fullness about the end, which is God. He's the only way.